Welcome, everyone, to Georgetown University and to the webinar conference, Interreligious Responses to Laudato Si, a 5th anniversary celebration and reaffirmation of Pope Francis's encyclical on care of our common home. And today's second session, How Laudato Si Resonates Among Religious Traditions. This session and the webinar are sponsored by the President's Office, the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and the Office for Global Engagement at Georgetown University, and by the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. I'm Mary Evelyn Tucker, and I direct with John Grimm the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. We hope you'll refer to the website and make use of the resources there. It's fore.yale.edu, and there's a newsletter. There's a section on Laudato Si, there's one on climate change, and there's sections on all the major world religions and indigenous religions. Let me introduce those on today's panel. Mohammed Farouk from the University of Cleveland, Vasudha Narayan, the University of Florida, and Koichi Sugino, the Religions for Peace, and a member of Risho Kosekkai. I'll introduce them one by one in a moment. But the panelists will be speaking in this order of introduction. And before we begin with Professor Farouk, let me tell viewers how they can submit questions to the panel. Please email your questions to berkeleycenter@georgetown.edu. Now, Berkeley is not the California one. It's spelled B-E-R-K-L-E-Y, center, all one word. BERKLEY center@georgetown.edu. So first, let me introduce Professor Mohammed Farouk from the University of Cincinnati, a visiting assistant professor there. He earned his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and served as an exchange scholar at Harvard and it was a George Ames postdoctoral fellow at Fordham University. His forthcoming book from the University of Michigan addresses what it means to be human in a secular post-Enlightenment world by exploring notions of selfhood and subjectivity in Islamic and comparative thought. He has published in many journals, received awards and grants from Mellon Foundation and others, and his current research explores modern and pre-modern conceptions of selfhood and identity and their bearing in ethics, aesthetics, religion, and literature. Please join me in welcoming Mohammed Farouk. Thank you, Professor Farouk. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mary, for that very kind introduction. Thanks to Dr. Borelli for kindly inviting me to this really important interreligious conference on climate change. So since we're operating under time constraint, I'll try to get to the talk directly. So I will also share my screen. So at this point, I think, I'm going to share my screen and then begin my presentation. Personally, when I read Pope Francis's amazing document, encyclical Laudato Si, I was really fascinated because it touches on so many different dimensions. Perhaps it was so comprehensive, perhaps touches on every bit of the environmental crisis and from various perspectives, economic, political, and then technological, and then religious, theological, et cetera, and I was telling myself, it really resonates so deeply within various Islamic perspectives and responses that we see also. So for this presentation, of course, it's just 12 to 15 minutes. So I'll only be able to focus on some of the salient points that definitely have their kind of resonances in Pope's encyclical as well, and we should see that very soon. So for me, actually, when I think about climate change, when I think about environmental crisis, ecological crisis, of course, we know it's very complicated. It's really, really multifaceted because there's an economic dimension to it, and there are purely technical details, et cetera, and then course, politics is important. And oftentimes people kind of, say there is environmental ethics, ethical, or under ethics, they would say religion and so forth. But that is something people perhaps don't pay too much attention to. But within that ethical dimension, perhaps one can include philosophical, theological dimensions, but I would put them in separate categories. But when we kind of move away from the purely economic and political considerations, for me, the root cause of the root cause of the crisis actually comes back to this issue of what I call the crisis of modern subjectivity. So for me, despite the fact that there are all these different dimensions, the crisis of the environment ultimately mirrors the crisis of modern subjectivity, which is largely defined by this Cartesian paradigm of res cogitans on the one hand, the thinking thing, and the res extensa, the extended thing, this thinking thing then pits itself against the rest of the creation, res extensa, for example, and which is now relegated to the status of a soulless machine. Of course, there are a lot of these debates. I don't want to get into the kind of history of it and the kind of philosophical nuances, going back to Augustine, Plato, mind-body dualism. There are all sorts of debates and lots of scholarship has been done. But I want to kind of turn our attention to the kind of practical implication of this paradigm, which I believe, despite the fact that Cartesianism fell out of favor in many circles, but still reflects the kind of the mentality of the age, zeitgeist, spirit of the age, zeitgeist. Excuse me. So this Cartesian self, and so I'm going to give a concrete example. So this Cartesian self, or this Cartesian view of self and nature, is taken over by what Pope Francis calls the technocratic paradigm, and here is a concrete example. So some years ago, the Yale-trained legal scholar and social scientist, Boaventura Santos, was invited to actually chair an ethical tribunal concerning the highly disputed Yasuni ITT project in Amazonia. So this Yasuni ITT project was an alternative to the oil extraction capitalist model that is responsible for the disappearance of two peoples, the Titetes and the Sensahuris people between 1960 and 1990. So this is not a small matter. So in the middle of this heated exchange, one person suddenly got up, representing some corporation, and then asked Boaventura directly, "Oh, so Professor Boaventura, you're supposed to be an expert. You're a lawyer, you know things about nature, etc., etc. So now tell me something." Quote, "These Indians are crazy, aren't they? How can we give rights to an object?" End of quote. Meaning, how can we give rights to a nature? Because it's supposed to be, as I said, in the Cartesian paradigm, soulless machine and so forth. Then Boaventura responded by saying that if we remain really dogmatic about this Cartesian view of nature, that nature is it's an inert, soulless object, then the concept of Pachamama, or Mother Earth in the indigenous tradition, will never make sense to us. And this is what we were taught in school. And thanks to the post-colonial education, all over the world, more or less, apart from some exceptions, because we really think of nature as something that's just an object or kind of natural resources that we can exploit and so forth. So so this really shows that the kind of heart of the issue, as far as I'm concerned, unless we kind of redefine our selfhood vis-a-vis nature and understand the interrelationship at the level of existence, being, consciousness. I'm going to give more examples. Perhaps we can come up with temporary solutions, but we'll not get there quite. So so these alternative modes of experiencing the self and the world. So this brings me to, there's a lot that can be said, but I want to focus from within the Islamic tradition, this idea that I frame as the great chain of consciousness. So it's the idea that everything is nature is imbued with consciousness, who is alpha, beginning, and omega is pure consciousness, that is ultimate reality. And there are different terms for it in the Islamic tradition. So So there's a verse in the Quran that says, there is not a thing, but he made his praise. Or so everything sings his praise, and similar verses exist in other traditions too. Now, when you talk about these things and you think of rocks, minerals, and everyone thinks, really, what does that mean? People raise eyebrows and so forth. So, the great 13th century Sufi poet, who is also one of the best-selling poets in America these days, Rumi, Jalal al-Din Rumi. So he has a rejoinder for these people. So now I'm going to actually, so I'm explaining this idea of great chain of consciousness, but through this poem by Rumi. So I'm going to quickly read a poem, and then with that, we'll also get a sense of what does that mean? What does it mean to talk about this idea of great chain of consciousness? How is that related to our present crisis? So, so Rumi has this poem. Let me read. Quote, each glorifies thee in a different fashion, and that one is unaware of the state of this one. Humans disbelieve in the glorification uttered by inanimate things. But those inanimate things are masters in performing worship. Nay, the 2 and 70 sects, everyone, are unaware of each other and in great doubt. Since two speakers have no knowledge of each other's state, how will it be with wall and door? Since I'm heedless of the glorification uttered by one who speaks, how should my heart perceive the glorification of that which is mute? In other words, minerals, rocks, and so forth. So he's saying, we as human beings, we're called sometimes by philosophers language animals. By, like sometimes we come from the same land, we speak the same tongue and so forth, and still we have so much difficulty understanding each other. And so if that is the case with human beings as supposed to be conscious beings and so forth, what would be the case with, when it comes to inanimate objects and so forth? Then Rumi says, only the spiritually adept whose inner vision is awakened by the eye of the heart can perceive the subtle mystery of the distinct mystery of every creature's distinct mode of singing God's praise. So further bit of this, last bit of this poem, let me quote. No one knows except the deified human, in whose heart is a spiritual touchstone. The rest hold only an opinion. They fly to their nest with a single wing. So it's fascinating when I read this poem, and I saw, I noticed that in Laudato Si, in the encyclical, Pope Francis quotes the Sufi, 16th century Sufi from Egypt, Al-Khawaz, who also echoes Rumi's point precisely by saying that this kind of subtle mysteries in nature through each and every movement of different creatures or different entities can only be perceived by the mystical initiate. In other words, people need to develop that kind of spiritual sensitivity and get out of this Cartesian mindset of, here's I am thinking thing, and there's no contact with the other, which is kind of extended thing, completely inert and so forth. We live in that paradigm and kind of are ingrained in that world, kind of internalized it to such an extent that we cannot simply get out of it. Then, of course, it would be very hard to kind of see how it is possible to understand kind of the kind of mode of consciousness that is kind of there within each being. So to kind of summarize this particular point, the great chain of being idea presents a perspective in which all levels of reality within nature are interconnected, forming, as it were, a living whole. But also need to quickly point out that this should not be confused with modern panpsychism, which is also espoused by some atheist philosophers like Philip Goff, Galen Strawson, in which, in their perspective too, consciousness pervades everything, even matter, but there is no transcendence. So there is the difference, but it's highly interesting because both of these views have implications for the environment. Now the question is, I have a few minutes only, 2 minutes perhaps. The question is how to disseminate these teachings. So Pope Francis also talks about this ecological education. So perhaps in the discussion, we can talk more about how we can disseminate some of this teaching. But one quick example, or I move on to the next slide. So, I mean, I don't want to get into the philosophical details, but, in the kind of philosophical tradition, there are all sorts of complex view of nature, through this idea of the great chain of consciousness. Every creature is endowed with a particular mode of consciousness. But anyway, how to disseminate some of these teachings? What are some of the concrete practical steps? So here is one concrete example, which many Muslims around the world are doing. And this is called what I call Islamic permaculture. Adopting the idea of permaculture from the biologist Bill Mollison. So permaculture is a holistic way of being that integrates land, people, resources, and the environment through mutually beneficial synergies. And Islamic permaculture seeks to enhance biodiversity on Earth in line with the Quranic eco-philosophy of nature and the self, that it speaks of the human custodianship of all living beings, including the Earth and the environment. And it also takes very seriously the doctrine of the great chain of consciousness, which is talked about, according to which there's a kind of wave of interconnectedness among all beings, both biologically and spiritually. For example, here's a concrete manifestation of what the idea looks like in real life. So this is a permaculture firm, and at the left bottom, you can see the picture. This person who's with his wife. The person is called Iskander Wauruntu. So he manages this firm. This is called a permaculture firm, and he happens to be also a mystical initiate in the mystical tradition of Islam called Sufism. So so there is an ethical dimension to it. You study certain ideas, the idea of what it means to be human in Islam, in Sufism, and so forth, and then you also make use of certain technical means to form these synergies to concretely manifest this interconnectedness of land, people, environment, resources, and so forth. I think the picture itself really shows. When you see this picture, just speaks to me. Everything really come together. But this idea of permaculture, it's simply living in harmony in nature. I can give you some simple examples. Just growing plants, it's just like even cultivating plants, growing your own fruits, vegetables. It's a kind of way of developing relationship with nature. I think anyone can do it. Anyway, I'll end it here, but this is the last, just the last bit. So we talked about the kind of human roots of the crisis, and then we talked about alternative conceptions of nature. And then I have given a kind of practical example, Islamic permaculture, how we can incorporate these real theoretical teachings, not just to be discussed philosophically, but have kind of practical implications. To kind of deal with environmental crisis from a religious / ethical philosophical perspective, because the other dimensions are also important, the technical and economic and so forth. So it comes down to this particular code, I think, everything. And this code I really like. It's by an environmentalist called Vandana Shiva, who really puts it beautifully, saying, quote, "Our future is inseparable from the future of the Earth. It's no accident that the word human has its roots in humus, the Latin word for soil. Adam, the first human in the Abrahamic traditions, is derived from Adama, meaning soil in Hebrew." End of quote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Wonderful. I didn't get where the permaculture was. Did you say where that picture was of the permaculture?
Yes, that was in Indonesia. A small suburb, a small town in Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country with 200 billion Muslims.
Yes, yes, excellent. Well, it was wonderful to see that. And there's a lot going on in Indonesia, isn't there? With fatwas against killing of animals, and there's the prasenjats, the schools that are teaching ecology through Islamic teachings and so on. Yes, so this is exciting to see the examples on the ground. Wonderful. Thank you. So let's move to our next panelist. And that was a nice transition from Vandana Shiva to Vasudha Narayan, who is a professor, distinguished professor in the Department of Religion and a director of the Center for the Study of Hindu Traditions at the University of Florida. She's also a past president of the major organization for the study of religion, the American Academy of Religion, She was educated at the universities of Madras and Bombay and at Harvard University. She's the author of or editor of 7 books and numerous articles, chapters in books, and encyclopedia entries. I'd like to claim her participation in the Harvard conferences, and especially the Daedalus volume on religion and ecology, Can the Climate Change, where she did a wonderful article on Hinduism and ecology. Again, her research has been funded by many prominent organizations, including the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Social Science Research Council. Vasudha, we're happy to welcome you, and over to you for sharing screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Namaste. And thank you all for inviting me today. It's a privilege to be here. While I worked on Hinduism and the environment earlier, I offered 2 other qualifications for my participation today. I studied under the tutelage of Franciscan nuns all the way from kindergarten to high school. And my academic career began with my teaching at the Illinois Benedictine College and DePaul University. But it was a good Franciscan nuns who must have prayed hard to intervene on my behalf to the 4 saints of impossible causes. The second reason is that my name Vasudha itself means the earth goddess in Sanskrit. Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si is literally and figuratively groundbreaking. And yes, it's addressed to all of us to take care of our common home. It's an invitation, a cordial and an urgent invitation to all of us to come together and work together in saving our earth. This is the only planet we have right now under our care. The force of this encyclical is not on looking at 2 separate distinctive crises, ecological and social, but in seeing the environmental degradation as an assault on social justice and an assault on our human dignity. And it's couched in authority. But this encyclical, Laudato Si, is now added to the body of the Church's social teaching. That's number 15 here. The encyclical itself begins with a sense of urgency, what we've done to willfully destroy this beautiful planet. We, through our selfishness, thinking just of ourselves, not only trample on and abuse this earth, but our brothers and sisters who live right now, and our children who are yet to be born. We've poisoned this earth, and we have ravaged and stolen from our grandchildren. It's our selfishness, our greed, our hubris that has led us to this crisis, but it is a message of hope. It is a message of optimism. We can get out of this if we work together. And in number 67, he says, when human beings place themselves at the center, they give absolute priority and immediate convenience, and all else becomes relative. It is also a mindset of those who say, let us allow the invisible forces of the market to regulate the economy and consider their impact on our society and nature as collateral damage. Hinduism is vast and long. I do not purport to talk or represent a billion plus people. I'll focus on just one tradition in the south of India, which has been vastly influential, and provide some examples of what Hinduism has done, the examples that I see which resonate with Laudato Si itself. And finally, I address briefly the part about social justice, which Pope Francis is just so dear to his heart. That on social justice and consumerism, and see one idea in the Hindu tradition, impermanence, as expressed in the Vishnu Purana. The theological, the spiritual model which provide the sources, and one which I find helpful to me in understanding Pope Francis's Laudato Si, comes from a particular theologian called Ramanuja. And he was the most important teacher of the Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya in South India, one which has had enormous influence in many parts of this world, in the temples. He lived in the 11th century. And who was he? He was a scholar philosopher whose central part of the theology is to see the entire universe as the body of God. It is called the Sharira Shariri Bhavam. God is the soul. We, and by we, I mean us human beings, those with consciousness, and those that without consciousness, that is earth, the universe, the entire material universe and time, form the body of God. We are not God. God is the soul, but we form the body of God. And I find this particular philosophy, this theology of Ramanuja, which is so central in many ways, helpful in getting some of the points in Laudato Si. He says, Ramanuja says that when the Supreme Being is ineffable, it can be understood in two ways. The cosmic form, where God is the soul and we are the body, and the auspicious form he takes on in incarnations, and to make himself accessible to us. He looks to earlier Tamil poets for inspiration. A particular verse from Namarvar, a 9th century poet, one of my colleagues, Francis Clooney, a Jesuit and a professor at Harvard University, has also worked on this poem and on Ramanuja. In this, Namarvar says, becoming all things spread on the certainties of sky, of fire, wind, water, and earth, he is in each of them. Hidden, he pervades like life in the body. This supreme being who's ineffable spreads like our life in our body. And yet, according to the radiant scriptures, he is one who devoured them all. The last sentence is actually a reference to a story, a narrative in the Hindu scriptures, in which at the end of time, at the time of dissolution, the Supreme Being swallows the earth and lies as one with all of creation. There have been many comparisons made by Teilhard de Chardin and Ramanuja, panentheism and the universe as the body of God. And this is where we see the connections between some parts. There are many differences, but we also see the connections between some of the theology in the church and Ramanuja's way of thinking. The environmental implications of this have been worked out by Sally McFaig and Patricia Mummy, and fully worth looking at. The earth is also seen as a goddess, sometimes in distress and saved by Vishnu. Narratives form a very important part of our way of thinking. So while there's a theology of people like Ramanuja and many others, it's the narratives and the stories, the customs which give the immediacy, the interpretation to the scriptures. And I'll look at a few examples by way of conclusion. Some examples of on-the-ground initiatives where temples, gurus have connected spirituality with saving the environment. The gold-plated towers of the Tirumala Tirupati temple, one of the oldest temples in India, announce it as a premier institution. And yet this temple has also taken the lead now in the green initiative, the green carpet welcome, focusing on forestation, focusing on giving vriksha prasadam, trees, as a symbol of the Lord's favor to all the devotees who go there. Chinnajir, a monastic head in the tradition of Ramanuja, has also spoken about the earth as the mother and how we should all, and in the United Nations Roundtable, has worked with others to see how we can restore and repair and seek forgiveness from the earth. Gurus like Ma Amritanandamayi, Amachi, Srila Sri Ravi Shankar, and many others have also spoken and have very active environmental programs. They draw from the spirituality of the Hindu traditions. People like Ramanuja, for instance, Amachi says that creation and the creator are not two. It is this principle that informs and motivates various environmental programs and the green initiatives. Sri Ravi Shankar, The Art of Living, have also worked hard to promote banning plastics, planting trees, and so on. Finally, a note on how we address the social injustice. Pope Francis quite correctly points out how this environmental degradation really affects the poor much more than many others. It is they who bear the brunt of this, what we have done and passed on. Strangely enough, in a small B&B near Galway in Ireland last year, I saw this little sign, "The Earth Laughs and Flowers" by Emerson. That line is not so much a happy line, it's a line of impermanence. It's a line that's connected with the fading of human beings and asking us not to be attached to things, not to buy more and more things, and not to keep taking. It's been at the line that the earth has enough for everyone's needs, but not for everyone's greed, has been attributed to many people. In a poem called Hamatreya, Emerson has really looked at a text from the Vishnu Purana. And in the text, Hindu text, the Vishnu Purana, there's a conversation in which between the two rishis, two holy people, in which a long list of rulers are spoken of. And they say, where are these rulers right now? The boast of heredity and the pomp of power, where is all that? Well, all these kings who wanted to conquer earth, they lie under the earth, they're gone. And the lists of poems show that all that we grab, where are we? We're under the earth. And the poem in the Vishnu Purana says, "Earth laughs in autumnal flowers." This line and this passage, Emerson translates for us and interprets for us. Where are these men who seek dominion, who want things, asleep beneath the grounds, and strangers, fond as they, their furrows plow? Earth laughs and flowers to see her boastful boys. Earth proud of the earth which is not theirs. Who steer the plow but cannot steer the feet clear of the grave. And so Emerson's poem, which is from the the Vishnu Purana, says, "They call me theirs who so control me, yet everyone wished to stay and is gone. How am I theirs? How is this earth theirs if they cannot hold me, but I hold them?" This is actually the sentiment of the Vishnu Purana. And it shows the interconnectedness of all of us. I'll end with a small quotation. This earth is very important, but we're interconnected. We're a small one in an innumerable galaxy. But we hear that the very molecules that make up our body, the atoms that construct our molecules, are traceable to the crucibles that were the centers of high mass stars that exploded their rich guts into the galaxy. And we're all connected to each other, biologically, to the earth, and to the rest of this earth. This was the teaching actually of Ramanuja, and that I find most interesting. And this interconnectedness is what Pope Francis speaks about in Laudato Si. We are in the universe, and the universe is in us. And when we degrade the universe, we're degrading ourselves. the last two encyclicals, the most important encyclicals of Pope Francis, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti, remind me of a line from a Tamil verse, a Tamil poem from the 2nd century, 1st to 2nd century CE. Yadum Ure, Yavarum Kelir, all places home, all people kin. And until we recognize this, we may be repeating the sins of the past, but we cannot, and we will not, and we must not. And with the many leaders showing the way and our enthusiasm, we can make it and show dignity to earth again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. And yeah, thank you so much, Vasudha. That was wonderful. And the connection to Teilhard de Chardin and Ramanuja is so magnificent. And I hope we can talk about that maybe in the Q&A. Let me give you just one question on that and the sense of this body of God. How would you, just in a few more sentences, elaborate the connection with Teilhard and Ramanuja?
I should also not diminish the differences.
Yeah.
But I would say the fact that we are so interconnected and form part of this giant pulsating organism. And Teilhard de Chardin was himself, I think he had a chemistry background, if I remember right.
He's a paleontologist.
Paleontologist, sorry,
Yep.
right.
That's right.
And could see that particular connection with this earth in so many different ways. And I think it's that intricate connection, what we saw in the end from an astronomer, astrophysicist too. We see this coming from so many sources. Why are we blind? Why are we deaf? Why can't we see? Why is it so easy to press that button for a one-click Amazon purchase? It comes down to that. It comes down to control of ourselves and to see ourselves in this humility, but as that humility as interconnected with all other beings and singing the glory of the Supreme Being. And this Supreme Being I see as the one who is ineffable. Mm-hmm. Yet, and this is where the beauty I see of the connections, it's seen, it takes flesh, it takes material form to make itself accessible to all of us. And it's like a hologram. And so if we take this entire universe, every part of it is like a hologram. And in taking care of my garden, I'm taking care of the entire universe, or trying to. Every detail is so important and not too small. Sorry if I sound like a preacher. It is important. It's so important to get that passion in the children.
Yes.
Love that it is being made so accessible in so many parts of the world right now.
Absolutely.
Thank you for all the work that you and Georgetown have done to spread the message and to show the light in one more part of the world.
Well, thank you so much. The notion of an 11th century thinker as connected to a 20th century thinker like Teilhard, we can also come back to Sri Aurobindo, the great 19th century thinker, who had an evolutionary consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So let's return to that. And these comparisons, bringing forward into our own time, the great resources of this sense that this panentheism, but that the soul of the divine is here, isn't it?
Right. And when I say you, I mean according to Ramanuja, a 3-in-1 package. The soul, the divine one within you, your soul, and that pervades your soul, which pervades your body.
Yes, yes. And of course, we could go back to Mohammed with Rumi, right? And the tremendous sense. Do you want to just jump in here for a minute, Mohammed, on Rumi and that beautiful poem?
Indeed. I mean, so that Rumi poem, if you recall, in the Laudato Si, there's those poems by, from the Canticles of Saint Francis, calling, water, sister, water, brother, son, and those things. So, I mean, you see how the mystics perceive, this consciousness within everything, that pervades us, the entirety of one's existence. So it's very clear that unless we change this understanding of ourselves, I just want to come back to this, I always ask myself, what is it that we as modern humans have so much difficulty understanding this connection? It seems kind of theoretical and so forth. Whereas, so I'm actually a traveler. Also, I love traveling a lot, and I do travel different parts of the world, mingle with people, and kind of understand different lifestyles and so forth. So if I also cited that example in Amazonia, where two peoples completely, two different communities were wiped out because of this corporation and so forth. But I've seen a lot of documentaries, also talked to some of these people. So it really comes down to understanding of the self and the lifestyle and in the environment in which we are kind of grounded and so forth. And so for some, I mean, that was the case with, maybe Ramanuja or, other thinkers and Rumi, and back in their age, the situation was maybe different and more kind of, they were able to understand these things because there was no kind of modern technology around and modern architecture, alienation and so forth. But nonetheless, and given our own situation, the challenge is to recover that connection. And it's perhaps, it might seem kind of far-fetched, but for me, as I said, and permaculture, for example, can be one of those ways. Just start growing plants, just try to do something practical, develop, and then see what happens as we cultivate plants. And again, people these days only think of utilitarian gains. Even from that perspective, growing our own vegetables, fruits, and it'll simply, you can save some money. We don't have to even go to the gym. You just have to, a lot of exercise and so forth. So yeah, it's amazing.
That's great. And I think this panel is illustrating, isn't it, the ideas and practice, the theory and the action, and how closely connected, and why the academic community, as it goes through these amazing traditions and texts and poetry and thinkers and so on, bringing it forward to retrieve and reevaluate and reconstruct these traditions for modern times, which is marvelous. And I can see we have lots of threads to pick up here. But let's go over to our Japanese colleague and Risho Kosakai Buddhism. And I'd like to introduce Reverend Koichi Sugino, who is the International Secretary. He was appointed as Deputy Secretary General in 2011 of the Religions for Peace at their international meeting in Marrakesh. He assists the Secretary General of Religions for Peace in the organization's overall management and governance, and coordinates Religions for Peace affiliated international interreligious councils, women and youth networks alike. And I should say Religions for Peace is over 50 years old now, and that Reverend Sugino has worked directly in diplomacy, multi-religious diplomacy in Iraq, Syria, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and so on. And he is an engaged Buddhist leader, working with very senior leaders across different religions. He received his law degree from Chuo University in Tokyo in 1989, and an international law degree and international human rights law from the University of Wisconsin in 1993. And he also worked as a research officer with the Office of UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva. He's an ordained Dharma teacher in the Risho Kosakai, a major Japanese Buddhist denomination. And he graduated from Gakurin Buddhist Seminary in Tokyo in 1991. We're so grateful to have you here today. And please join me in welcoming Reverend Sugino. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tucker. I will follow other panelists to share screen. I hope this works. Okay, I will start with this quote.
Fine.
Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. Inner peace is closely related to care for ecology and for the common good. It is a return to simplicity, which allows us to stop and appreciate the small things, to be grateful for the opportunities which life affords us, to be spiritually detached from what we possess, and not to succumb to sadness for what we lack. Some might consider these quotes as Buddhist teachings of interrelatedness, inner peace, middle path, simplicity, contentment, and detachment. In fact, these are the messages of Pope Francis in his encyclical Laudato Si. Buddhist leaders from across the globe express their strong solidarity and support for Laudato Si, as world's religious communities advocated for the Paris Agreement on climate change. Such considerable resemblance between Christian and Buddhist expressions of shared values and commitments demonstrates an emerging global interreligious consensus on fundamental values and virtues for the advancement of integral human development. The notion of dependent origination makes clear that what we experience as self arises out of interaction with others and the nature. Self and other are mutually implicated. The notion that one could somehow attain enlightenment outside of relationship with others is an illusion. Non-self is a mystic notion. A human subject exists, but they have no fixed essence that we would ordinarily call a substantial self. The doctrine of non-self, paradoxically, is designed on the one hand to protect us from a dangerous illusion of a false self, and on the other, invite us into mysterious experience of being a subject intimately connected in the endless web of dependent origination. Clinging to an imaginary self can produce harmful selfish desires, cravings, attachments, hatreds, ill will, conceit, and other defilements. In the Lotus Sutra, the Bodhisattva is an ideal of the fulfillment of true self. At its core, the notion links benefiting oneself through benefiting others, while the notion of the Bodhisattva is intrinsically altruistic. It radically expresses the Buddhist notion of dependent origination. From a Buddhist perspective, human and other forms of life are interdependent and reciprocal. It is not only human life, but all sentient life that is endowed with the potential for enlightenment, called Buddha nature. Such awareness leads to the insight of a deep compassion for all sentient life, which is so intimately connected with ourselves. A living entity can neither isolate itself from this causal nexus, nor have an essence of its own. Pope Francis says, fraternity is an essential human quality, for we are all relational beings. A lively awareness of our relatedness helps us to look upon and treat each person as a true sister or brother. Without fraternity, it is impossible to build a just society and a solid and lasting peace. What is critical what is a critical prerequisite and foundation for the notion and practice of fraternity in Buddhism and Christianity? Non-self or self-emptying in Buddhism and kenosis in Christianity are the key dynamics in our interactions with other. Self-emptying creates the space for the other to be the other, offers a form of self-donation, and expresses the true meaning of love or compassion. Pope Francis links our ecological crisis with the deeply interconnected problems of our economics, politics, and culture. Allow me to introduce a comparative study of the value orientations of Christian and Buddhist business leaders and entrepreneurs in 3 dimensions: ontological conceptions, procedural values, and values of other directedness. Christian ontological conceptions focus more on the dignity of human being, created in the image of God, while the Buddhist business leaders in this particular study emphasize the organic interconnectedness of all sentient beings. In terms of the implementation of business practices, justice was noted in the Christian value orientations, while moderation and mindfulness were more central among Buddhists. The relationship with others is influenced by solidarity in Christian value orientations and by compassion in Buddhist value orientations. Buddhist value orientations can be further categorized as in the table: interconnectedness, non-self, selflessness, and inseparatedness from others, moderation, simplicity, generosity, and contentment, mindfulness, wisdom, creativity, and nonviolence, and compassion, genuine care, well-being, and responsibility. Although the value orientations of Christian and Buddhist entrepreneurs have different ontological backgrounds, both value orientations are implemented by similar practices in business. COVID-19 has exposed an unsustainable economic paradigm. A German-born British economist, Professor Schumacher, who served as economic advisor to the government of Burma, applied Buddhist Eightfold Path to develop Buddhist economics. In Buddhist economics, consumption is considered to be merely a means to human well-being. The aim is to obtain the maximum of well-being with a minimum of consumption. In Buddhist economics, simplicity and nonviolence are closely related, producing a high degree of human satisfaction by means of a relatively low rate of consumption, allows people to live without great pressure and strain. And modest use of resources and living in highly self-sufficient local communities are less likely to get involved in violence. From the point of view of Buddhist economics, production from local resources for local needs is the most rational way of economic life. Cooperative banking, decentralized energy, and localizing the production and exchange of basic commodities are encouraged and promoted in Buddhist economics. There have been various efforts to put into practice key elements of Buddhist economics, including the ongoing Eco Temple project as a prototype of Buddhist integral human development. This experiment of Buddhist holistic and integral human and ecological development advances following interrelated components simultaneously: ecological temple structure and energy system, economic sustainability, integration with surrounding environment, engagement with community, and development of spiritual values and teachings on environment, eco-dharma, and cultivating good habits. The project has been advanced by socially engaged Buddhist communities and leaders in various Asian countries. Everything is interconnected, and that genuine care for our own lives and our relationships with nature is inseparable from fraternity, justice, and faithfulness to others. Buddhists have co-built representative, action-oriented, and sustainable interreligious councils together with their Christian, Muslim, Hindu, and other partners to build peace, advance sustainable development, and protecting the earth. Buddhists and Muslims discern shared values and commitments to respond to intercommunal violence. Religions of Peace Myanmar nurtured the habit of collaboration and responded to COVID-19 by providing humanitarian assistance and used tree planting as a means of environmental protection and stress reduction from the pandemic. Buddhists are also part of the International Coalition to Protect Rainforest through the International Rainforest Initiative. Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh says, "Forests are our lungs outside of our bodies." Yet we have been acting in a way that has allowed millions of square miles of land to be deforested. If we want to change the situation, we must begin by being our true selves. To be our true selves means we have to be the forest. If we visualize ourselves as the forest, we will experience the hopes and fears of the trees. If we don't do this, the forest will die, and we will lose our chance for peace. Religions of Peace, UN Environmental Program, and other partners, such as our Honorable Moderators Institution, Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, are part of this coalition to bring religious and indigenous communities together to protect the rainforest. At the end of the Second Vatican Council in 1965, Nostra Aetate, the Declaration on the Relation of the Catholic Church to non-Christian religions, was adopted. Mahayana Buddhist leader Reverend Nikkyo Niwano was invited as the only Buddhist to join the opening of the final session of the Second Vatican Council on September 14th, 1965, and had a private audience with Pope Paul VI. Pope Francis hosted a Buddhist-Christian dialogue at the Vatican just before Laudato Si was issued, and his message then was on fraternity, which culminated in the most recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti. Buddhist approach to integral ecological and human development has been evolving and is becoming multi-religious, multi-sectoral, and multi-dimensional. We should continue our shared journey to creatively implement and concretize the spirit of Laudato Si. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Reverend Sugino. That was wonderful. And I want to repeat the email address if you have any questions, to send it to Berkeley Center, one word, at georgetown.edu. Berkeley is B-E-R-K-L-E-Y, not the Berkeley, California, B-E-R-K-L-E-Y. Berkeley Center at georgetown.edu. So maybe we can pick up one or two questions from your extraordinary informative talk. And the resources, obviously, of Buddhism, of interconnection, interdependence, and so on are quite remarkable. And you've given some wonderful examples. May I ask, in Japan, and maybe a little bit about Risho Kosakai, is Risho Kosakai embracing this eco-Buddhism? And I noticed you had the temples in Thailand and China and so on. So give us a little feel for Japan and the Buddhist ecology movement there.
Thank you so much. Many of our partners know International Network of Engaged Buddhists, headquartered in Thailand.
Mhm.
And there is a global network, including Japan, Japanese Mahayana Buddhist leaders and practitioners. There is a conscious effort to make the places of worship as green as possible, and also that the teaching of the Dharma, that the teaching, Buddhist teaching on eco-Dharma, we say, is integrated into the Buddhist pastoral approach. So I think that SDGs are sometimes used, integral human development that Laudato Si emphasizes, together with secular public goals of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, are gradually integrated into the social life of Japanese society, and also integrated into religious practice, Buddhist practice in our daily lives.
Thank you. That's terrific. And the Engaged Buddhist group based in Thailand, partly Sulak Shivaraska, of course, was one of the great founders and leaders of that movement. And as we know, it has a counterpart here in the US with engaged Buddhists like Gary Snyder and so on. Do you want to make any comment about the Asian and American relationships in engaged Buddhism and ecology?
Yes, thank you so much. The Pope Francis invited American Buddhists to the Vatican before the Laudato Si was issued. So we had a wonderful encounter and a meeting with Pope Francis in 2015, and American Buddhists from with different Buddhist streams, different ethnic Buddhism, and also American modern Buddhists were together with Pope Francis. And we had a wonderful conversation, and but it was really interesting. It was part of my presentation. The Pope Francis, while sharing the essence of Laudato Si, he emphasized the importance of fraternity.
Mm-hmm.
So nothing can be accomplished without the spirit of fraternity. So now we have encyclical, new encyclical, and everything is interrelated. So that the Laudato Si and the Fratelli Tutti, they are all interrelated, and we have to work together to realize the spirit of those encyclicals. Wonderful.
Now, I'd love to continue with each one of you, and we have one question I'd like to bring forward from the Berkeley Center email for Mohammed. And then I'd also like to invite the three of you into any questions you might have with each other or comments to follow up, okay? So Mohammed, this is from Joseph Prabhu, who's Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at California State University in LA. And he's asking, the interconnection of consciousness does not mean equality of consciousness. Humans are seen as imago Dei, the image of God, with a special consciousness that the non-human world does not share. This is true in Christianity in any case. This seems to contradict your line of argument. Please clarify. Okay?
Sure. Thank you very much for that question. So the phrase that I used to explain this idea of interconnectedness of all beings to consciousness was the great chain of consciousness. So it's a, so if you might there's this poet in the very famous poet Alexander Pope from the English very famous poet, 18th century. So he was the one who coined this term, the Great Chain of Being, which is familiar. And there's a famous book, Great Chain of Being by Lovejoy. So it's there in the Western tradition from the very beginning. Spiritus, and then you have kind of soul or mind, and then the body and so forth, and the God on top, and then interconnecting all beings. So that's one way of looking at it. And then in the Islamic tradition, because people talk about consciousness, they began with God as pure consciousness and all the way to kind of a stony consciousness and so forth. So I don't think I said that in this scheme, everyone shares their mode of consciousness equally, or it's the kind of same consciousness that you see in humans, you see in dolphins, you see in minerals. Otherwise, what is the point of even talking great chain of consciousness? So there's clearly a hierarchy. But what is important is to understand that it's not the Cartesian paradigm where there's a kind of absolute separation between kind of human consciousness and the rest of the world, which is even thought of as inert and so forth. So in this kind of picture, it's a kind of circle of interconnectedness. You have different natural entities. Each has its own mode of kind of consciousness, plant consciousness, but it's not human intelligence. And then all the way up to God. But with human beings, there's an opening onto kind of universal consciousness. So with human beings, there's a kind of stages which allow you to kind of experience consciousness in itself, like as it pervades through the entirety of existence, all that there is. So yeah, it's not like the consciousness that we're talking about is the same in all different beings. It is different, but with that differentiation comes further the question of responsibility. What is supposed to be the relationship between us, who seem to have a degree of higher mode of consciousness, vis-a-vis those other beings which we're saying are not completely devoid of consciousness, but nonetheless they're connected. So then that becomes the question.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we could speak about this for Hinduism and so on, and also Confucianism and Taoism. Due Ming, the great Confucian scholar, speaks of the continuity of being, of universe, earth, and human, not a radical difference with transcendence and immanence, but a continuity. I don't know if we've got lots of other questions, but Vasudha and Koichi, do you want to make any comment about this, or something else might be on your mind? Vasudha, I see you jump in, please.
Not about this immediate point,
Okay.
but a generic point, which we can keep coming back to later.
Fine.
I also see, like all of us do, the many challenges we have.
Yeah.
We've been showing the positive things that have been happening.
Sure.
We've been trying to do that.
Yeah.
But there are many challenges that come from both the secular and the spiritual worlds.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, within Hinduism, just the sheer lack of resources may make the poor people pollute the river more or cut the closest tree next to them. Or the generic one is the rich people pouring toxic waste, into the river. The religious challenge would come in that sometimes people simply think, oh, River Ganga is so pure, she purifies the world. We make her impure, and therefore not think twice. They use that as a rationale about polluting the river. So religion can be a hindrance sometimes. What would be the kinds of challenges we see that we should collectively address? But if it's too big, we can come back to it at a later time.
I think that's a terrific point. Thank you, because it's true, we're facing enormous problems, the pollution problem, the climate change issues, a technocratic paradigm that we're going to come back to of economics that Joseph is also pointing to. And the rivers, of course, the Yamuna, the Ganges being sacred rivers, and as you say, Hinduism has a sense that purity and pollution are not problems that the purity of the river will be sustained. But we did a conference on the Yamuna River with Srivasta Goswami, the great religious leader in Vrindavan, where the head of the Krishna devotionalism is based, the Bhakti tradition. And his sense is he's very, very worried about his own members of his very ancient temple and so on, and their health and so on. So we know, I'm not answering your question, but because I'm just raising it from, this is where we need, don't we? Science, hydrologists, policy people, and religious people coming together. And that's what we tried to create in Vrindavan. And Rancor Prime has also done this for the Ganges River and others. So there's a new effort on the Ganges River for cleanup, et cetera, but it can't happen, right, without the religious communities coming together. So you're raising a very important challenge, for sure. Koichi, do you want to come in on any particular issue at this point?
Yes, that we are faced with tremendous, large global challenges. But I think COVID situation, although it's a very painful reality, but maybe giving us space to creatively develop alternative economic model. And I shared Buddhist economics. It was introduced in 1966, so a long time ago. And of course, for many of the economists, modern economists, it sounded like a very utopian kind of naive way of looking at things. But in the post-COVID situation, we have to work together to develop new economic model, and the paradigm shift has to take place. And I think religious communities, religious traditions have a lot to offer in this process.
Yes, thank you. That's so well said and so succinctly. Thank you, Koichi. Let's introduce this question, all right, on the technocratic paradigm that relates to what you've just said and what we're all concerned about, new economic models, right, ecological economics. So Joseph Prabhu follows up and says, Pope Francis correctly sees the technocratic paradigm as a special problem of the modern West that sadly has spread around the world. In a nutshell, that paradigm sees the human as special beings with special powers invested in modern science and mathematics. How can ancient religions best counter this modern Western hubris? If I can just add the word, not just modern science, but modern technology and an economics where progress without limits is part of the problem, right? Economic progress, market-driven capitalism without limits. So all of this is part of a technocratic mindset that's going to solve things. And I think many of us see this in universities. It's going to be geoengineering, or it's going to be another technological fix. So I don't know, Vasudha, would you like to jump in here, and then Mohammed on this topic? Let's see, whomever, one of you has to unmute. Can you unmute?
Perhaps Mohammed first, and then I can follow.
Okay, Mohammed, please go ahead.
I would love to, actually. This is something that I feel I have so much to say, because I really think about the educational system and the interconnecting of all the different sciences. And what Pope Francis at one point mentions, if I remember correctly, no sciences should work alone when it comes to the environmental crisis, economics, and then environmental studies, religious studies, all of these are kind of important. So a couple of things. So I first of all, to reiterate this, there is no ecology without a kind of adequate anthropology. So unfortunately, if the way I say it, when it comes to the environmental studies program, for example, the programs that we have in various universities in the US, in Europe, probably other places, you'd see students taking a lot of courses, for example, in various sciences, because it's a kind of interdisciplinary program, biology, chemistry, and then about energy and so forth. And then sometimes there are courses on kind of social policy and so forth. But I hardly see anything on anything concrete on religious anthropology or religion and the environment. I myself am teaching a course at the University of Cincinnati on religion and the environment, and I'm sure there are a few here and there, but I'm not sure whether, it's kind of, it will be cross-listed with the environmental studies. So it seems like we're still, there's this compartmentalization of different sciences. And it is really important that we understand how humanities, for example, are equally important when it comes to dealing with something as big as the environmental crisis, where definitely, there has to be a technological fix for this, or, new economic paradigms and so forth. But, the ethical and philosophical questions, the points about the self, why does it matter so much if we have a false notion of the self? For example, as in Buddhism, and as I was saying, in the Cartesian view, if the self is thought of as a thinking thing, as opposed to something that is, that is made of consciousness, and that consciousness is not just kind of restricted to human, it's everywhere. So that those paradigms, I think are very important, but we have to kind of figure out how we can disseminate, as Pope Francis was saying, ecological education. So for me, I still see, for example, when it comes to the Islamic world, disseminating knowledge about the environment. So there are a lot of initiatives. For example, a few years ago, right after Pope Francis issued the encyclical, there was this, if I remember correctly, it was Islamic Declaration on Global Climate Change. Huge conference and symposium took place in Turkey. And then there are all these points about economics, mainly how we should kind of curb profit, maximization models and so forth, and kind of trying to kind of limit the activities of corporations, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can name many other initiatives. For example, in Kuwait, there's this 7-year plan and so forth. So sometimes, to be honest with yourself, some of these things are good, but people are just focusing on profit, or partly seeing the problem as emanating from, all right, it's kind of materialism and so forth. But I think it's deeper than that. It has to do with how we think of ourselves in the whole scheme of being and so forth. So I feel one of the challenges would be to disseminate these alternative ways of experiencing the self and the world at various levels, starting with kind of high school or middle school, high school, and then college education and so forth. And I see it as a real challenge because, I don't see it at the point, maybe there should be some courses that should be made compulsory for everyone, and it should have different views, not just one particular view. But I see no other way but to kind of have different perspectives and let students know that this is really matters, and people have to know something about this crisis, not just from one point of view, economics or politics.
Yep. This is why it's a worldview shift, right? It's a shift of consciousness, as you're saying over and over again. And this is what our teacher, Thomas Berry, was saying. We don't have a comprehensive story that really locates the human as coming out of this extraordinary evolutionary process with complexity, with beauty, with diversity, and so on. We're not going to make the shift fully. And so that's a very, very important point. I just wanted to underscore before we go to Vasudha that the Muslim declaration and your reference to the economics from a Muslim point of view, as you know, for many years, we've worked closely with Fazlun Khalid, who's been a very strong critic of modern capitalism and its problems in terms of equity and justice and so on. And his latest book, I don't have the title in my head, but it's a magnificent critique along these lines of a technocratic paradigm and a mindless economic system that's destroying the very basis of life. So Fazlun Khalid was involved in that declaration, and he's been a long-time worker, as you know, in this area. Now, Vasudha, you might want to pick up another point, but if you want to join the thread here, please do, or bring in something else that might be on your mind.
Well, one of the themes that I see going here is education.
Yeah.
And I see us zooming in and zooming out here from the global vision, which we all should have, and that's where Laudato Si comes in, inviting all of us to the table to a potluck dinner, so to speak, so we can all contribute and all work on this together. But it's also very local.
Mm-hmm.
And for every one of us to pitch in, it has to be my temple, my teacher, which speaks to me, and not a broader vision. And so I think one of the things that I've been doing the last few decades is to see what are the kinds of movements that seem to work, not the big government programs which have a lot of hoopla and then we don't see anything much coming out of them, but what are the individual programs that work within each tradition? And the sources of authority are different. So the points I'm making are, one, we can't just rely on a drizzle down theory, and we need the weight of the authority of someone big making the point here, Pope Francis. But we need every church to pick it up. And even this morning we heard that that's not happening.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we should not simply think of our sin against the environment, against nature as a kind of venial sin. It can become a mortal sin zone.
Mm-hmm.
Our lives are at stake. And so we need the weight of authority. What are the authorities in each tradition? In Hinduism, it's not just the text. The texts are important. There are many texts, but there are so many of them and they all have different, carry different weights. So what works? Stories. Stories about Mother Ganga needing our help. Stories about the force of deforestation and Shiva's head being bereft of hair, so the plains are being flooded. Those are the narratives people are putting forth there. Local teachers, whether it's Amritanandamayi or Ravi Shankar or someone, who can speak and inspire that action. Custom, you can valorize statements from scripture. This is a beautiful line from the Matsya Purana, in which the kinship with plants or trees is spoken by the goddess herself, who says, one tree is equal to 10 suns. Saying that you think of suns as important, a tree is so important. And that was way back more than 1,000 years ago when the book was written. We need to valorize those texts, but put them out in action. And each tradition is different in that. So yes, we have the common points. We agree on some of these. What is it that will motivate us to go out and act now? That's where our problem is, and that's where our answer is.
Yes, wonderful statement. I couldn't agree more. That's what we're trying to do, right? Synergize the ideas with the action, the inspiration with the perspiration, the image of the tree in the Bhagavad Gita with the planting and the prasad that you've eloquently spoken about.
And what you're trying to do, get the policymakers here, what you're doing, getting not just the religious people, but others who can implement this to the table, what you've been doing for 25, 30 years now at least, is the kind of thing we need 100-fold.
Yes, yes. And I do want to say, just back to one of Mohammed's points, and you all know this in the academic world, that the problem is science has led, and science and technology, and then law and economics have been driving the action, and religion and ethics and spirituality are in the margins. That's what I was saying this morning in my comments, that we've got to overcome this. And Yale is terrific in so many ways, but that split is still very much present. Now we have a number of other, yes, Mohammed.
If I may quickly jump in very quickly, and I couldn't agree more with what Professor Narayanan has said. Really, it's not just about, the global vision is extremely important, definitely as a kind of roadmap, but the local actions are going to make changes. So those examples that she mentioned, and one I also mentioned in Indonesia, this permaculture activity, or not just in Indonesia, in many other places, where there are these people doing things amazingly well and helpful for the environment, for themselves. It's a mode of being. So you have to understand that it's also not very complicated. So this permaculture thing, there are two, you can boil it down to two components, the ethical component we have to understand technological advancement and materialism are not the goals and so forth. Up to a certain point, everyone needs some of these things. And then there is the pure technical ways of cultivating land and so forth. And so one has those, and one has convinced oneself about at least these 2 points. Then one can do it, on one's own, even in an apartment, start cultivating a plant, developing a relationship. And then in Indonesia, just very briefly, as you said about education, so there's this Muhammadiyah, the Muslim National Organization. They have actually developed this educational curriculum where they have incorporated some of these ecological teachings. So I think there needs to be more such steps, and there are lots of mosques doing, but sometimes there are things kind of watered down. It's just about waste management, plastic. At other times, it's more profound. So I think, we have to identify what needs to be done exactly where and so forth.
Right. Thank you. We've been trying to work on the greening of seminaries, all over for the same reason. And at Yale, we have, fortunately, a master's now in the seminary on religion and ecology. But we have 2 other questions that I want to offer here, and then we'll have time for some maybe final remarks. So this one is a very specific question about how do you all view the American judicial decision that corporations are people, citizens united. Are corporations then considered people in the case of interconnectedness? Surely, whether or not we agree they are people, they have a responsibility to respect and protect the environment. And this is from Ann Armstrong from the National Guard Educational Foundation in Washington. So I think you're familiar with, and if you're not, that's okay, but this decision that was made that corporations are people and can give to political campaigns and so on. And this has put a lot of money into politics, among other things. So if anyone wants to jump in here, I don't know, Koichi, do you want to make any response?
Just a quick point there. Amen. If they are people, they should act with responsibility and dignity and treat the earth with absolute love.
Yes.
I don't see any corporation doing.
Yeah.
And if corporations are human beings, I would also urge the judicial system, which, like India, to recognize our trees, our rivers as human beings, because they have the rivers and natural phenomena in India have legal rights. And I would say, go there if you can have a corporation as having legal human rights. I think nature should have rights also.
Absolutely. That's such a wonderful point, Vasudha. And I just want to elaborate that many of you know that the rights of nature is actually moving forward. It has passed the court system for the Ganges and the Yamuna, actually, in India, although it stopped in another judiciary process. But the rights of nature, which Thomas Berry was supporting years ago, and he did a wonderful piece on earth jurisprudence, is something that is having quite a bit of traction. The river in New Zealand, with Maori efforts, has gained rights. There was an effort to give the rights to Lake Erie, actually, and through Toledo, which unfortunately was beaten back. But this rights of nature movement is something that we need to pay a lot of attention to. So thank you for bringing that up. Anybody else? Koichi, do you want to respond to this question about corporations?
Just, I think a rights-based approach is extremely important. I would like to mention the 2 notions, that the value and the virtue. And virtues, the values are important, and value-based institutions are important. And virtues are habitual orientation to values. And it's related to how to educate ordinary people about the essence of Laudato Si. And the local approach is needed, and value-based education is needed, and virtue ethics are important. So habitual orientation to values is critical. So we have to engage the different notions and approaches.
Yes, very good. And I know in Japan, that's a big issue, kyoiku, the education and seishin, and where the values come in. And so thank you for that. I think we've got a few other questions that I'd like to also jump into. One brings us along the lines of values and spirituality. And this is saying, I'm not a theologian and so on, but the Christians like myself have been taught, oh no, sorry, I wanted to do first, this one of, so that this person, I'm not sure who it is, but she or he is saying that many traditions have more in common than differences. Much of what's been said is reflected in Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart, and Vasuddha spoke of we are in the universe, the earth is in us, Ramanuja's point. And this corresponds to Meister Eckhart's notion of the ground of the soul and the ground of God are the same ground. And we've touched already on many of these great metaphors of thinkers and spiritual leaders are comparable in the different traditions. This questioner is simply saying, Hildegard of Bingen, for example, Father John Bembrick, thank you. Father John is saying that Hildegard of Bingen's cosmic egg and this God's greeningness, the greening figure, the notion of a pulsating and gestating universe. So anyway, he's saying Hildegard understood this 900 years before Pope Francis called the earth our common home. So do you agree that we share much more in terms of spirituality and mysticism, and that maybe we can find an ecological equilibrium in that? Or let me just add, maybe we can find ecological spiritualities that add to this transformation that we're hoping for. Anybody want to jump in there? Yes, Mohammed.
Yes, I completely agree. And in fact, there is some literature already on what's called eco-spirituality. And so, yeah, I mean, for example, that some of these poems by Saint Francis resonate so well with a lot of these Sufi poems about nature and so forth, because nature is seen as theophany, as the place where God is manifesting himself or herself, and it's a never-ending manifestation. But from the perspective, from the point of view of how, we can integrate these teachings and at the same time be able to respond to the crisis, I'd go back to what, in Laudato Si, Pope Francis was talking about spiritual education, and how when it comes to spirituality in this context, the idea of inner peace and so forth that we human beings naturally desire is actually very much connected to how we deal with nature. So I mean, again, Cartesian view of nature simply doesn't allow that. But when we move past beyond that, we kind of pay more and more attention to nature, or kind of spend time in nature, we understand that nature is actually something that reveals, love, compassion, and all of these values in so many different ways. I mean, all these natural phenomena, it's simply impossible to kind of remain kind of completely unmoved, when we see something so beautiful, water flowing and ocean and all of these things. So, they're meant to, in a way, awaken certain, not just feelings, but certain, awaken deeper layers of the self within ourselves. If I can use that, I see the self as something multi-layered and so forth. Mm-hmm. So, the idea of peace is intimately connected with how we actually meet nature, understand nature, behave, toward nature.
Yeah. Thank you. That's wonderful. And there's a whole large website on ecological spirituality that Leslie Sponcel at the University of Hawaii has done. He's worked with Buddhism in Southeast Asia and Thailand. His wife is Thai, and he's part of that Buddhism and ecology movement. And he's also very involved in indigenous traditions and ecology. So spiritual ecology is his website, spiritual ecology. Anybody else on this point of common spirituality or mysticism to bring us together? I mean, I think it's yes, yes, yes.
Yes, I think it's absolutely correct. I fully agree with the writer. And that shouldn't lull us into a sense of contemplative connections without the action.
Yes.
And I don't think in a deep way that will happen. I mean, if we really are get into that mysticism, it's not simply the inner, but it shows out as in St. Francis. the connection with other people and nature. So in all of this, I think in the mysticism and everything else, to feel the pain of other people, to feel the pain of nature. When one gets into that, I think that's where the action can begin.
Yes.
So that's the beauty of Laudato Si, where the two are not separated. The misery, the suffering of those who want food, and the earth who has enough to give, but who's being manipulated in different ways.
You're right.
And to get to work this together for a more harmonious way of looking, feeling, understanding, and acting. But the mysticism is it's there. I mean, those people look at us in the face. The cultural differences are immense, and we have to pay attention to them too.
Right. And there's a whole movement of spiritual activists, actually engaged activists. So I have another question or two, but Koichi, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, and I think spirituality and concrete action can go together. I quoted the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh. The sun is our heart,
Yes.
and trees are our lungs. So that kind of understanding were translated into tree planting in many Asian countries, and tree planting has been part of Buddhist practice. So I think the spirituality and concrete practice can go together.
Thank you. And what a wonderful example, Thich Nhat Hanh. I used to begin my Buddhism class with his book on the Heart of Understanding, and he would say, here on this page, you will see a cloud, because the cloud feeds the tree feeds the land, and so his interbeing is extraordinary. All right. Now, there's a question, so thank you, Koichi. There's a question that relates, I think, to this sense, and I love what you've all said. Spirituality without action is incomplete. And this question is, how can we shift to work on behalf of Mother Earth and cosmos and not get swamped in to assimilate all the diverse worldviews? When and how do we accept the benefits and shortcomings of all and of each of our traditions? I'm asking if we need a mega view, a mega view. While you're thinking, I'll jump in, but please, just very briefly, that's why we did the journey of the universe. That's why this sense that we're part of a 14 billion year unfolding universe that most of the world's religions have no problem with, because the Kalpas in India, huge senses of time, Buddhism, interdependence, ongoingness of, and so on. So that sense that we're connected to something vast and beautiful, it's a worldview that I think also includes and incorporates and builds on the diversity of world's religions. But anybody want to jump in?
That's why I ended that quotation with that quotation from the astrophysicist.
Yeah.
We are part of the huge evolving universe. The mind, it's mind-boggling, but it should not. And while it's astounding to think of us as just one little part here, it shouldn't freeze our action.
Yeah.
Because this reality and this yuck I've created around me, this mess that I've done and I'm leaving as a legacy for my kids, that is real too. We have to keep zooming in and out, just as we did between global vision and our local action. In terms of time, in terms of what our planet is, it's one little planet in this gigantic universe. But please, let's not mess it up more than we've already done. But we've got to work with hope. I'm trying to remember the poet who said, work without hope draws nectar in a sieve. Hope without an object cannot live. And I think that's, we have to work with that hope here. And that's where we need a big vision.
Yep,
We need our leaders to inspire us.
definitely, definitely. Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful. Mohammed, please. And then
Very quickly, perhaps I would approach it perhaps from a slightly different perspective. And incidentally, it also reminded me of something, again, Pope Francis mentions, like if it comes down to also how we understand, the body, the self, all of these things, because, and again, we know there are different conceptions of this thing. So if in a worldview where human beings are simply seen as one being among all these billions of other species and so forth, then what is the point? What is the point of all of this talk on responsibility? How is it that human beings are so different from insects or rocks and so forth? So here, I mean, the questions of paradigms, it may be uncomfortable, but I guess, we have to address it and people have to make up their own minds about it. Because in the Christian view, for example, and in the Islamic view also, the idea of responsibility, human beings as God's vicegerent, for example, in the Islamic tradition, and similar conceptions in stewardship and so forth. I mean, how do you derive those notions and through which methodology from a purely, if we start with the idea of that it's just the body, molecules banging in each other. So when I'm talking about interconnectedness, I definitely agree that it's multidimensional. There's a biological interconnectedness. In fact, we study some of these things, food web, food chain, or even beyond that. But there's also a spiritual connection. That's where the consciousness part comes in. But again, there are different views on these things. So while I would have really wanted if we could all share this mega vision, but for practical purposes, I think we also have to agree that there should be some differences, but that do not prevent people from getting together, working for because the suffering is the kind of suffering is what brings us all together. So while I see, when it comes to regular Muslim leaders not agreeing with a lot of even, things that the Sufis are saying, or even within Hinduism, the dualism of Shankara is kind of somewhat opposed to Ramanuja, as far as I'm aware, it's qualified non-dualism and all these differences. Right. But perhaps, we accept that, but we know that for practical purposes, we can still work together because it's in our common destiny, as Bandana Shiva, that code I pointed out.
Very good. Thank you, Mohammed. And Koichi, your thoughts?
Just very briefly, I think the paradigm shift is coming, and we have to be prepared for that. And even if it's a small localized efforts or experiment at the local level, I know that in Catholic community, Focolare movement is doing economy of sharing, economy of the sharing is very close to the Buddhist approach, Buddhist economics. So I think in order to prepare ourselves for the big paradigm shift, we have to build, accumulate, even if small, concrete examples of people working together in the spirit of Laudato Si and respecting each other, respecting differences, more localized, being content with what we have. So that kind of approach we have to start building in order to receive the new paradigm shift.
Wonderful. And here to conclude our seminar, our webinar, thank you so much, first of all, Koichi and Mohammed and Vasudha. Dr. John Borelli, our very dear friend for many years, will conclude us with his wonderful dog.
Well, thank you. I've been listening to this wonderful panel quietly and passionately all afternoon, and now the postal deliverer comes when it's time to unmute. But first of all, thank all of you. First of all, thank you, Mary Evelyn, for moderating and really engaging all of the panelists in an ongoing discussion. This has been a very, very rich experience. Koichi Sugino, it's good to hear you again. Thank you very much. And from the many examples you bring from your experience. And of course, Vasudha Narayan, you are just a premier scholar and you bring in so many wonderful connections with Hindu traditions and everything. Thank you again. And Mohammed Farouk, thank you for your presentation. something that was rich that I didn't expect. It was a different angle that I was expecting, and it was a great contribution. And a congratulations to you, because you're newly professor at the University of Cincinnati. Is that right? So here's a man who's gotten a position during the
Thank you.
pandemic. Congratulations to you. One of the comments that we had was from Father Don Rooney, who's president of the Catholic Association of Diocesan Ecumenical and Interreligious Officers. And he said, thank you all. This afternoon's program is a tool he can take to his membership to get grassroots interfaith conversations going on, to cooperate and work together in implementing Laudato Si. So he sees a great tool already in what's been presented here. And I just wanted to say that we have one more session, which will be tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time in Washington. It's our final session for this 3-session webinar conference. It's implementation of Laudato Si, a call for multi-religious cooperation, and it'll be moderated by our professor, our director of the Georgetown Environmental Initiative, and our Laudato Si professor of biology and the environment, Peter Mara. And we have 4 panelists. We have a rabbi who is founder of Shomrei Adama, Keepers of the Earth, which is a Jewish network for congregational implementation of ecological programs. We have a priest advisor to the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. As you know, the Green Patriarch, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, has been a leader for over 2 decades in this work. We have the principal policy advisor at the United Nations Environment Program, Face for Earth, a Muslim. And we have someone from the dicastery, the Vatican dicastery for promoting integral human development, one of the officials. This is the dicastery charged with implementing the encyclical. So it should be a very rich program tomorrow. The viewers, thank you. You enter tomorrow's program through the ways that you've entered today. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions and all of the comments. We appreciate that you signed in and that you enjoyed this as much as we have. And thank you again to the 4 of you. Hands up, how about that for a true thank you.
Thank
for
you.
everyone.
Thank you to
Thank you
everyone.
so much.
Thank you so much for organizing this.
It was a privilege to be here today. Thank you.
Here.